to 2021 AGM of Ealing Civic Society. I hope everyone can both see me and hear me. This is our second virtual AGM. You may recall that last year we delayed our AGM until later in the year in the hope that we could actually run it face to face. But in the end, we had to choose the virtual option. I don't think that any of us will have anticipated then having to repeat the same format this year. But here we are again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Anne Chapman, and I've been acting chairman of the Society for the past 2 years. I'm pleased to see that we have sufficient people with us that we're now quorate. In terms of participation, we'll be using the vote function to approve various items on the agenda. If you have a question at any point, can I ask you please to use the Zoom chat function, which we will try to monitor. Participants are all now muted, and I would ask you only to unmute yourselves if you wish to speak or if you're going to speak so we can avoid background noise during the meeting. If you have a webcam enabled on your device, you will be visible to all participants. And if you don't wish to be seen, you can turn your video off. We are recording the meeting and the presentation for our YouTube channel. So again, there may be times when participants will be visible on that recording. So if you don't wish to appear on the recording, then turn your camera off, please. The timing for the meeting, including our speaker, is expected to be something between 75 and 90 minutes. So without more ado, I'm going to now start screen sharing for my presentation. And you'll see me as a small thumbnail at the side of the screen. Our AGM follows the agenda which is set out here, and we also sent out in the notice of the meeting. I haven't received any apologies in advance of the meeting. Does anyone have any apologies for absence to pass on? Please wave. No, thank you. We now start with our report of the year's activities. And if anyone has any questions, they put them in the chat and I'll respond to those at the end. So I need to change my screen share to my presentation. I can start talking about some of the highs and lows of the last year. The last year has not been normal, but I think we can say we've adapted well to the changing environment. We've made use of virtual meetings and events. And in one of the brief respites last summer from lockdown, we were actually able to unveil one of our plaques to the singer Dusty Springfield at the site of her old school, which has been refurbished and reopened as Ealing Fields High School. We've also installed another plaque and hope to be unveiling the details, hope to be announcing details of its actual unveiling later this year when we can hold an event. We also have another plaque in the pipeline, which we will hope to install and unveil later this year. A success of a different nature has been the listing of Ealing Park Tavern, pub on the South Ealing Road that has been closed for some time and which has been the subject of a successful planning application for conversion to flats with a pub to be retained. We were concerned that many historic features could be lost and hoped that listing would help. We see this as a substantial success because gaining a listing is not easy. The Society has tried with other buildings in the past, and more recently, a largely unchanged arts and crafts house in Hanwell, which was threatened with, or still is threatened with demolition, was not accepted for listing, which was very sad. In further positive news, 2 contentious tower developments have actually been refused by the council's planning committee. But unfortunately, their own application to develop Percival House was passed. I'll return to these later. The workload of dealing with the many planning applications and follow-up input to committees, etc., is proving really challenging and is leaving us limited or no time for wider development of the Society's activities. A personal low for many of us was the news in December of the death of Corinne Templar. Corinne had been a major player in Ealing for several decades. She always championed the cause of our heritage and the civic movement, and we will be celebrating her life at a future event. Moving on to developments. These will all seem incredibly familiar because they've all been going on for a very long time. The town hall, very little changes, the saga continues. The council took full advantage of the year given to them by the Charity Commission to provide additional information, following which the Charity Commission quickly agreed that the revised scheme could be made. The Friends of Victoria Hall have actively engaged with meetings of the Council's General Purposes Committee, who are acting as trustees of the Trust, repeatedly pointing out errors, inconsistencies and omissions in the proposals, but to no avail. The Friends remain firmly of the view that the now proposed scheme still does not protect the Trust property and has been invalidly made, and the next step for the Friends is to mount a challenge to the Charity Tribunal. Percival House, the council's own civic offices. This project has actually made considerable progress in the last 9 months, particularly compared to the previous couple of years. The planning application was submitted. As we expected, it took little account of feedback from amenity groups, including the Society, and from residents. Following a period of inactivity, some very minor changes were made to address a concern raised by Historic England over the materials for the 26-storey tower. Their other concerns regarding the impact of the tower, particularly on the listed town hall and Christ the Saviour Church, were just brushed aside. Unfortunately, Historic England's assessment of harm is summed up in the phrase we see again and again, less than substantial harm. It leaves it to planning officers to balance the harm against any alleged public benefit. Unsurprisingly, at least to us in this case, the council's officer judged that the benefits far outweigh any harm. We tried to persuade Historic England to strengthen their objections or to again write to the council, unfortunately without success. Thanks to the efforts of many groups, a massive number of objections to the proposals were received, but these did nothing to dissuade the council's planning officer from recommending the scheme to planning committee for approval. The decision process was plagued with procedural and technical problems that resulted in 1 deferred committee and 1 decision to approve judged to be unsound. At the 3rd attempt, a decision was reached. This is not the end of the saga, as the application must be referred to the Mayor of London, who may overturn it, and it may also be referred to the Secretary of State for determination. Local groups are actively involved in pursuing both routes. The Filmworks development, again a long-running saga. Construction still continues. A number of buildings, though, are now at full height above the hoardings, and an active marketing campaign for the flats is going on. The restored facade has recently been exposed, as you see in the lower picture there. The hoardings on the Broadway have now actually been completely removed, so we can get a feel for the new look. Last year, we'd hoped that Picture House, the cinema provider, would be delivered the cinema shell sometime in 2020. This date has repeatedly slipped and is now likely to be the middle of this year. The space then has to be fitted out, so a cinema will not be appearing before spring of next year. Ealing Broadway and other Crossrail stations. There have been further delays to Ealing Broadway station, but other stations in the borough have fared better, and 3 are now open, including Hanwell with several restored original features and also step-free access to the platforms. The Ealing Broadway canopy is nearing completion, and although very large, it does look impressive. The ticket hall and lifts are yet again delayed and are now not expected to be delivered until after May this year. We reported last year that the council's public realm proposals had been withdrawn. It's rumoured that revised proposals are shortly to be revealed. Returning to the 2 refusals of planning, which I referred to earlier, the Manor Road Tower and the Gurnell Leisure Centre site. These were actually both surprising decisions based on previous planning committees. The committee agreed with campaigners that the Manor Road Tower would dominate the local area, and also they had concerns that although the development is unusually 100% affordable according to the GLA definition, it was not truly affordable to local people in housing need. The refusal has been taken to appeal by the applicants, and a public inquiry is to take place virtually in July. The Stop the Towers group has been accepted as a party to the inquiry, essentially meaning that they can present their case to the inquiry alongside the council and the applicant. We have contributed to their statement of case and will be following the proceedings with interest. The Gurnell application was also refused on multiple grounds, particularly the incursion onto metropolitan open land and the height, the scale and the design. While this could also go to appeal, it's possible that a modified proposal may be put forward if the applicant thinks this would overcome the concerns of the committee. Moving to other events in the last year. Last year was indeed somewhat limited. We contributed to a not very open house weekend, and we also held a virtual awards ceremony. As live group guided events were not available, we derived or revived a number of local walks as self-guided excursions. We cannot say how many people followed any of these, but we do know from some positive feedback that some did. And these walks remain on our website for anyone to download and follow at any time. We prove that our awards judging and awards ceremony can be conducted entirely virtually. Entries were assessed electronically and awards presented at a virtual ceremony. This doesn't have quite the attraction of a face-to-face event, but has allowed us to commence some interesting local projects. So what do we hope to do this year? We hope we're gradually returning to normality, although virtual events will still have a part to play. In place of our John Delafon's annual lecture, we will this year be commemorating Corinne Templar and her contribution to civic life through a virtual event in early June. We will share reminiscences and anecdotes and give members the opportunity to share your own memories. Civic Day this year is scheduled for the 19th of June, but we have not heard if or how this can go ahead, as the date falls before our full freedom from lockdown. We will be running a virtual public lecture in July on the fascinating history of the Great West Road. The Open City team are hoping to open some buildings again this year. We're working with the local volunteer coordinator for Ealing and neighbouring boroughs, who is keen to build up a catalogue of buildings that may be of interest. There are also likely to be walks included in the programme, giving us the opportunity to again promote our walks. And this year's award ceremony is planned for late October to take place live or virtually, yet to be confirmed. And finally, I'd like to end with the customary thanks to the Executive Committee and to all others who've helped us in the last year. I would like in particular to mention Tony Williams, who has been our newsletter editor for more than 10 years, but has decided he must now stand down from that role. Thank you, Tony, for all your hard work over the years. We will struggle to find a replacement. Can I also thank the members of our Environment Committee, who meet with me every 3 weeks or so to review and respond to planning applications. Over the past year, the number of these that we have considered has increased immensely, so we're hardly touching the surface across the borough. You can see details of the responses we submit, which are posted on our website by our webmaster every two months or so. My request for new blood to come onto our Executive Committee is a very real one. Apart from it not being good governance for committee members to serve for an unlimited term, we are severely overstretched to a point that is really becoming unsustainable. So can I put out a plea that anyone who is interested in getting more involved in our work, please do get in touch with me via email. So that completes my report, and I'm returning to the agenda as a reminder of the formal business of the meeting. Right. The next item on the agenda is to adopt the committee's report. So, Joe, if we could please show our first poll. And can I ask you all to select one option on the committee's report and then press submit. Please don't forget to press submit. I can't vote. Right. Has everyone who wishes to vote voted? We have 91% of people have voted. Okay, we'll close the vote now, and hopefully you can now see the poll results. So I'm delighted to say that the Executive Committee's report has been unanimously agreed. We now move on to we can stop that poll, and we now move on to the Treasurer's report for the past year. And I now ask our Treasurer, Josette Bishop, to present the accounts to you. Josette, if you'd like to unmute, and Joe, if you'd like to take that poll down. Thank you. Oh, so I can remove it. Thank you. Josette, can you unmute yourself, please? Thank you.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Good, thank you. So I'm just going to run through the accounts for 2020 very briefly, because I'm sure we want to hear talk this evening. So from the Treasurer's point of view, 2020 was pretty usual, and the only difference for me was that I didn't have to have so many expenses for live meetings. So that was the biggest difference in the year, but otherwise it was pretty much the pattern of the previous year. So I'm showing the accounts now, and I'll just run through income, expenses, and where we are with our bank balance. And first of all, I have to say that thank you, Colin Easton, for reviewing these accounts. They are unaudited accounts, but we do review the accounts with an independent person. And Colin has very kindly reviewed them and issued a report, which I'll show you here, just to show you that Colin has signed that he's reviewed these. So going back to income, our main income comes from subscriptions and donations, and we had a good year for donations. The large donation for the plaque of £687, that we've already spent, because we have ordered the plaque that's next in line to be unveiled from the manufacturer, and just the way it happened, we won't be invoiced for that plaque till this financial year. So that's why we show the receipt, but we don't show the expense for the plaque. Going down to expenses, you can see I didn't have so many events. So that was all paid very nicely out of the subscriptions we received. However, we did use the Legacies Fund, and if you remember from last year's talk, the general fund is usually where I put all the subscriptions and then pay the running costs. But the Legacies Fund is different, because that was a legacy received, I think, in about the year 2013. And we really use that for one-off special things that we want to part money for. So last year we made 3 separate donations to other organisations, 2 in Ealing and 1 in London. That was the Open House London. That was a September event that Anne referred to. We gave £1,000 to the Friends of Victoria Hall in Ealing, and we gave another £1,000 to the Gunnersbury estate, because if you remember, after they closed for COVID reasons, they then suffered a fire in the cafe, where the back of the cafe, they had the old carriages stored. So that was quite devastating year for them. So as a result, we were up last year here £527. And that meant that our bank balance increased from last year's bank balance to £19,395. And that's where we ended the year. I don't have anything else to add unless anyone's got any questions, which they might be able to type in. So perhaps if there aren't any questions, we would vote on the accounts, approving the accounts.
Okay, thank you, Josette. If you could stop screen sharing.
I will.
And Joe, let's have the second poll. Thank you. So please, if everyone can vote on whether they can accept the Treasurer's report. Anybody else wish to vote? Please remember, if you're going to vote, please press submit. Otherwise, it doesn't register. Okay, I think that's probably everyone who wishes to vote. So we can show the results, and we have 100% agreement to the Treasurer's report. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Josette.
Thank you.
We now move on to the election of officers. The current office, we have 3 officers. Currently, myself as acting chairman, Josette, our treasurer, and Joe Winters, our secretary. When I agreed to take up the role of acting chairman 2 years ago, it was intended to be a stopgap. Despite efforts to find new committee members and a potential chairman-elect, this has proved fruitless. And the impact of the pandemic has made this search no easier. Because I believe in the importance of what the civic society does, I've reluctantly agreed that I'll continue in this role. And I'm suggesting that, given that I have been chairman in all but name, I call myself chairman going forward rather than acting chairman, because acting chairman does tend to confuse people. So we have the same 3 officers all prepared to go forward in the same roles, and we have a poll to ask you to adopt those 3 names en bloc. So next poll, please, Joe. Please cast your votes. I think everybody who wishes to vote has voted. Has everyone pressed submit? Okay. May we see the results, please? Thank you. And again, we have unanimous approval of the officers. Thank you, everybody, for that confidence, vote of confidence. We now move on to electing the other committee members. As I mentioned earlier, sadly, during the year, we lost our Vice President, Corinne Templar, who had been a stalwart of the Executive Committee. All other current members have indicated their willingness to stand for a further year. Jenny Gadsby, our Membership Secretary, Philippa Dolphin, our Web Manager, Maggie Gold, who chairs our Communications Committee, Robert Gerd, William Hardman, and Tony Miller. No new members have been proposed. I have to say this leaves us particularly vulnerable, as if one or more of our members is unable to attend a meeting, we would become inquorate. However, we do have just sufficient members at the moment. So can we vote to adopt the proposed committee? Poll 4, please, Joe. Thank you. Please cast your votes. Anyone else wish to vote? A few more people eligible to vote. No, I think that's everyone who wishes to. Right, thank you. Again, unanimous agreement to the election of the committee members. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, committee members. We now move to a special item, which is the election of a life vice president. As was outlined in the agenda, the Executive Committee of the Society proposes that in recognition of his long and valued service to the Society, former chairman Robert Gurd should be elected as life vice president, and the membership is asked to support this proposal through another vote. Another vote, please, Joe. Everyone, please cast your vote. Okay. Does anyone else wish to cast a vote? Okay, thank you. And I'm delighted to say, as I expected, that yet again, the voting to elect Robert as vice president has been unanimous. So thank you very much, and I'm delighted to confirm his well-deserved election. When Robert resigned from the position of chairman of the Society, the Executive Committee wanted to mark his long service with a gift. This gift was acquired, but a succession of events meant it's never been presented. Bob's own illness, the illness of our vice president, and then the first and then subsequent lockdowns. We felt we should delay no longer, and this election has given us the opportunity to hand over the gift, albeit virtually. So, if you bear with me for a moment.
Okay.
Robert, please accept these small mementos of your time as chairman. We will arrange to get them to you. The final item of our formal business was AOB, and there have been no motions or other items of business declared. So that concludes the formal AGM, and we will now take a few moments while we set up the presentation with our speaker. Right, so our speaker, John, please start screen sharing when you're ready. Right. Excellent. Thank you, John. We can now see that. So our talk for this evening, our speaker tonight is John Collins, who is Historic Houses Senior Manager for the London Borough of Hounslow, our neighbouring borough. John was to have given us a talk at last year's AGM until we had to postpone, and we are delighted he's agreed to talk to us tonight. As I'm sure you'll know, Boston Manor House is located in Boston Manor Park in Brentford. It's a Grade 1 listed Jacobean manor house. A few years ago, it was in a very sorry state, but thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and other funding bodies, it's undergone a massive restoration project. The park is also, somewhat more controversially, undergoing a significant transformation. John's talk is entitled Boston Manor, Engaging the 21st Century, and he will, I hope, be telling us about the history of the house and the park, and talk about the renovation work, and maybe be able to tell us when the house hopes to reopen to the public. If anyone has any questions for John, please submit them using the Zoom chat function, and we'll take them at the end. So over to you, John. Your screen, just to say, your presentation keeps going between full screen and not full screen. So perhaps you might want to get it onto full screen again. But anyway, over to you when you're ready.
Yeah, I'm just going to check everyone can hear me, that I'm not muted anymore. Okay, great. Then I will put this to full screen so that everybody can see me. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all. And what I'm going to talk about is Boston Manor House and the project Engaging the 21st Century, which will see the complete refurbishment and restoration of the whole house. The title comes from the Heritage Lottery Fund, which have given £3.7 million. The whole project is very much needed for the house, and I'm going to talk about what the project is going to do, both inside and outside, and what we'll do with the house after the project is finished as well. But before I do any of that, I want to tell you a bit about the history of the house, which gives that context to why it's so important for it to have all this treatment to it. And the house's story, as is, starts in the 1620s. It was built by and for Lady Mary Read. The extract that's on the screen right now is from 1622. Lady Mary found herself in a position where her first husband had died, and this is a note from the place where she was, basically asking her to move all her stuff, and she needs somewhere to live. She's inherited Boston Manor, and she chooses to build the building that we have as part of that process, and she gets the house built very quickly. We see on a couple of spots in the house, both inside, and this is outside the house, which shows the 1622 date and her initials, the M and the R. What she built was a house that's both very similar and different to what we have today. What it maintains right from its first construction, though, and one of its finest features, are the plaster ceilings that you see inside. What you have here is a point in history, effectively, where the way craftsmen are working with plaster changes, and this is a relatively early example of English plasterwork, which was very good at the strap work, the things that you can see that are geometrical. But what's really coming through is this relief plaster, where you see in the center of the screen on the right, of the image on the right, I beg your pardon, where you're starting to have the development of images. And what you've got here are a series of different motifs that run through it. They deal with the senses, the elements, and it's quite likely that you would have actually selected out of a book that was in the repertoire of the craftsmen who are delivering it. But these examples have survived all the way through the history of the house and are still with us today. The house, though, Mary Read, she would go on to marry again. She married Sir Edward Spencer, of the Spencer family, of which Diana, Princess of Wales, was part. Again, she outlived her second husband, and she in fact survived until 1658, when she was 80 years old. And it's at that point that the house starts to develop under the guise of the Clitheroe family. Now, the very first Clitheroe to enter is James Clitheroe. Christopher Clitheroe comes into possession of the house age 16. And we've done an awful lot of research as part of the project about the history of the house. The Clitheroe family are going to be owning the house for over 250 years. So we did a lot of work, as they will be a central part of how we display the house in the future. We had an excellent researcher who helped us really delve into things that we just didn't know before. And Steph Hagen's work did things like uncover this signature for Christopher Clitheroe. The Clitheroes did things to the house as well, though. So you see Boston Manor House looking much as it does now. What they did particularly was the initial house that was built by Mary Read was the first two gables, the left and the centre gable. And the Clitheroes add the gable to the right-hand side. So they make the house a square house. And they do, through the course of their ownership, a lot of work to the house. We can see that over the period that they own it, you go from the original footprint on the left, the addition from there, early ownership of the house, and they just keep going further and further out. So we have what we refer to now as the service wing, for reasons you'll see in a moment. And a good sense of what the house looks like in its grounds from this plan, where you can see the pink to the right, the older parts, but you have all the supporting buildings, the stables, which still exist in this position, but any number of buildings on here that fill a number of different functions for the family. I have a fantastic image here, which shows all of the various things. It has its own, so the scullery on this side, there's all sorts of things from a blacksmith to a creamery. My favorite part of this is you see lines that join the image from the top left to the bottom right. The image, the line that runs at the bottom of that diagonally across is actually going from the brew house in the far right, and it's a pipe which runs into the kitchens to deliver the beer from the brew house. There's also a water line, which is the second one on the right. So this is employing a lot of people. There's an awful lot of records that we discovered about what the house consumed that tell us a lot about what was happening around the estate at the time and the history of the area with it. I'm going to move on and show you what they look. So the scullery, a bakehouse, you can see all the different things, the chicken house. There's an awful lot happening here to service the functions that are happening in the house. You've got an enormous history of the Clitheroes. They are resident in the house until all through the first quarter of the 20th century. In that time, the different family members occupy the house for different times. It's both the primary residence and not. There are members of the family who are involved in the East India Company. There are people who are pillars of the local community as magistrates. There's even a visit from King William and Queen Adelaide in the 19th century. And all of those stories are ones that we'll be bringing out in the interpretation in the house. And I'll talk a bit more about that as we go on. But to give the kind of potted history of the state of the building, you get to the 20th century and the house is not in a great condition. And really, that's the story of the 20th century for the house. The Clitheroes finally want to sell up, and they make an attempt to sell the house with all its grand contents, and unfortunately that fails. The house contents are sold separately by auction, and the house is sold to Brentford Urban District Council. They paid £23,000 for the park and the empty house in 1924. The house is pretty much open to the public whenever it can be, but in quite a limited way, because the house has a lot of 20th century uses. These clippings, again, through the research that's been done on the house, from let me check my date. Yeah, from 1940 to 61, there is a primary school in the house, but the house is really starting to creak at this point, and there's a bill for £35,000 estimated to do the repairs that the house needs. And actually the house gets a pretty decent refurbishment in the early 1960s by Donald Insall Architects. And in 1963, the Queen Mother opens the restored house. It goes on to have a number of other lives. It's a home for the National Institute of Houseworkers, which is perhaps a slightly doomed endeavour when you consider that what they were trying to do was train people into domestic service, probably a long time after the horse had bolted on domestic service in the 20th century at that point. And the house then goes on to have a life which will pretty much define it in the 20th century, which is the life that comes through what at that point is the Over 40s Association for Women. And in the majority of the house, so not the kind of most historic rooms, but through most of the rest of the house, there's a number of flats that are put in. They're effectively bedsits, one-bed flats that are then cover the whole service wing, the areas we're talking about where the various different tasks that supported the house were no longer needed, and on the top floor of the house as well. And in fact, into some of the historic parts of the third gable. Now, over time, those flats continued to be occupied. People were leaving by the 1990s, and by the end of the 90s, it was empty. But there'd also been a lot of intervention, as you can imagine, running power and water, and establishing a number of bathrooms, some for the house, some for the individual flats, but some communally. And as with all things, water is not the easiest to keep in the pipes at sometimes, and there was a lot of damage to the house, and it was really not in particularly good shape at all. To the extent that by the time we roll into the 21st century, the house is on the at-risk register, which is effectively saying that the house is really struggling. So I talked about the usage here. Effectively, what we had was a house that was open to the public on the ground floor to the left gable, and on the first floor, the left gable rooms. The house was open at the weekends through a season that ran from April to October. And so there was a very little you can see inside. The rest of the flats, the whole top floor, the whole right gable, everything else had been given over to flats, and they were in poor shape. The only people that seemed particularly happy with the flats being in poor shape were the producers of every crime drama you can possibly imagine, who were desperately keen to hire the house as a scene of, well, any number of crimes. So as you watch anything basically produced as a British crime drama, Boston Manor served as the backdrop, but that's not what we want for a house with this history and these many stories to tell. I always talk about Boston Manor being a witness to the history of Brentford. Although this house is from the 1620s, there's been a house in these grounds for a lot longer than that. And we think through the research we found that the reason this house was effectively built was that the old manor house, which we thought was behind this one, was derelict. And we even have record of a fire shortly after this house was built, some 30 years after it was built, which we suspect was the old building down. So Boston Manor really needed to be put on a footing where it could be more than a building that sat in a park, which was unfortunately what it was, because for a great many people, the people who commuted to the Great West Road would see a closed house. People who enjoyed the house in the week would see a closed house. It was actually quite difficult, especially as this entrance, the main entrance to the house, faces away from all the footfall that's in the park itself. So we've got a lot to put right. And what we do have, though, is the potential to introduce the house to many people who might not be aware of it before, or at least not aware of the extent of what it's got to offer. So work began, and work happened both inside and outside the house as well. We've had a lot of grants from a lot of organisations, but I'll mention specifically the ones as we go. We've repaired the roof. All of the features of the exterior have been dealt with to make much better condition than they were. The roof was part of an English Heritage grant, an English Heritage at-risk grant, which was really key to just kind of securing the building effectively, so that we could go through room by room, floor by floor. Every part of the house has been made good, and every part of the house will be used in the future as well, in a way that will mean that we should not have a repeat of the condition the house got through the 20th century. To give you a sense of some of the other stuff that we've done. So the stone porch at the front of the house. The stone porch is an oddity in that it's, although the entrance to the house probably always was there or thereabouts, the porch is a later addition. And one of the things the Clitheroes were consistent with is they added to the house. They added an awful lot to the house. It's a real mix of styles and decorations inside. And the same is true of the outside. They bolted things on. They were started out as city merchants, and they were always relatively well off, and well off enough that they were always part of a society where they wanted to impress people. So they did have the new thing. This stone porch, which is very grand, but really wasn't in a great condition. You can see from the image in the centre that it has long since had its day. And in the upper right, some of the damage you can see in that photo was actually quite significant. We also discovered that the area above, the sort of parapet above the porch itself, was in terrible condition. So this has been completely repaired. it's been done again through English Heritage's Historic House Foundation. Through the Historic House Foundation. It's still happening, actually. This work is some of the most recent. So it will be reinstalled with a completely repaired and refitted porch, which will give some of the grandeur back that it initially had. We had a bell and a bell cot, which again needed to be taken away. It needed quite a lot of work and an enormous crane to, as you can see here, take it away for refurbishing. It is now back, and while we don't intend to make the bell working, we've put it in really decent order now, so we should not be having problems again, I say, with any part of the house. And again, Historic England funding has been really integral to getting this done. The house will change, though. This is an artist's impression of the rear of the house, and it does give some sense of the higgledy-piggledy nature of what the Clitheroes did to add things here. But why I'm showing it in particular is the house will have, for the first time, a cafe. It will be entered through, you can see the little, I want to say parasols, but I can't find the right word. I'm going to go with parasols. For the cafe entrance. It will be also a way into the house. The previous entrance from the house, the green door represented here, takes you into a bit of a bottleneck, unfortunately. So that door's going to stay closed. And we're going to have the new cafe, which is in part of the house that was effectively derelict and abandoned flat. It was in really terrible state. And it will give us something more than we've ever had, which is the ability to draw people in for a reason other than coming to the house. It will be an offer that the park's not had before. It will be a hot food offer. And really what we intend to do is not just things in the house, but we really want to make sure that the house is part of the park. And we're going to do a lot of work to that end. So around the two lawns either side, we've got programming that we intend to run, all things hopeful with COVID, of course. But we have a number of activities, so there'll be art installations, performances. We've already started training a number of volunteers to give guided walks that begin and terminate at the house. And that kind of program of activity that not just takes people into the house, but connects the house with the park will be really important to the house's future as well. The house, you can see here the extent of it. To the left of the cafe, on the floor above the cafe in the service wing, those will be maker spaces. So people will hire workspaces in there for small and medium-sized businesses, where they will be creative industries, people who can work in there to produce. Those areas won't be open to the public. They'll be business spaces, but we've got plans that the people in there have a sympathetic perspective to the house. And we're hoping that we can work with some of those makers to provide some public programming that's available for the public as well, that we deliver through the house. The very top floor of the house, the three gables you can see here, we're going to give over, those are going to be 3 meeting rooms that will be available for public hire. So they're not for businesses to rent out, therefore the longest you can have really would be a day. But you can have them for short periods as well. So they'll be for community hires, business hires. And it's important as well in that both that, all the elements I've just mentioned of the things that are not public displays will be the 3 gables on the first and second floor. Those will be things that can generate an income for the house. So the house can help support itself. And it gives it that ability as well to ensure that all the house is used, which is really important in conservation. To ensure that you don't have dark parts of the building that aren't used is one of the best ways to make sure that the maintenance stays long-term on top of things. We're not just doing things inside though, we're doing things outside as well. You'll see the ceiling I mentioned earlier. You can see the relief work of the plaster, and here you see the overmantel as well. This was subject in the 1960s refurbishment to really quite a lot of interpretation, let's say, about how things were coloured. We know that the ceiling was white when it was first done. We've done paint analysis from scrapings to see what was there. And it seems in the 1960s, they seized on there being some colour that had been added in the 19th century, and they really went to town. So the image you see on the left, the motif is the sacrifice of Isaac. I remain convinced that somebody has presciently modelled the angel on Margaret Thatcher. I can't unsee that, and I never will. But what we're doing at the moment to both the overmantel and the ceiling is completely restoring it. So going back, taking some of the, I'm not quite sure what word I'm going to use to pick to describe the overmantel colouring, but softening it so that it is the original setup, which really gives you a sense of what Lady Mary Read would have had at the time. And that restoration process is also ensuring that, fortunately, above here, we had a set of communal bathrooms and showers. So the ceiling, although stabilized in the 1960s and actually doing a very decent job of stabilizing it, it's been further stabilized as well. So we now have nothing on top of it that should cause future damage. It should be structurally sound enough so that when the work that you see on the right, which is actually going on right at the moment, is completed, we'll have a very spectacular room restored to look as it would when Lady Mary Read first had the house. There's lots to find in the house, though. So this wallpaper was uncovered long before this refurbishment work. This was it's been known about for some time now, but it sits specifically at the top of the stair that runs from the second floor to the first. It's in quite an awkward corner, but we've had some very specialist advice, which is dating this to the 1750s. It doesn't quite make it the oldest wallpaper around, but it's one of the oldest examples in situ you will find anywhere in Britain. Not the oldest, sadly, but what we're going to do is we're going to reproduce this wallpaper. So protect and conserve the existing wallpaper has been and is ongoing. But on the left here, you see the trump door, which is the 3D effect of the banisters on the staircase. Where above it you see a kind of yellow wallpaper. We believe that the wallpaper here would actually have run all the way down the stairs. It would be quite a common thing to decorate like this for a big event like a wedding. So we're going to digitally reproduce this and restore it down the stairs. And this process of restoration of the interiors has actually sprung up some surprises for us. So the room on the top right here, that previously was in very poor condition, a former flat, but on stripping back the 20th century decorations, we've discovered the two panels you see on the left, which are the original panels for the room. There are some more original panels in here, but what we're going to do is restore that same design in that room. So this whole room will be panelled. It will have the original floorboards, and it will look as it would have at its pomp. That room is also going to be special exhibition space for us. There'll be two special exhibition spaces in the house. One will be an opportunity for people from the community to exhibit in the house. So we'd be looking particularly at groups and societies and organisations who wanted an exhibition space, and we'd make that available. But this room as well, there's been so much research we found that this room is going to be filled with special exhibitions that tell some of the stories that we've not initially been able to tell as part of the permanent interpretation. So there'll be a lot of interpretation put in that shows about the history of the Clitheroe family, but also the history of the house. Some of that 20th century history I talked about is absolutely ripe for further research, and it will mean that there's always plenty to come back for to see at the house. One of the things that there will be ability to see is a decoration scheme which is based on all the paint analysis and sampling that we've done. You can see an example here of the sample that this sample of the bottom right image with the quite vivid gold and quite deep red, which we've discovered through paint analysis is how this would have been decorated. So much of the decoration will be restored to specific periods in the house's history. As we've been doing it, we found lots of different things as well. We found an awful lot of wallpaper that has been covered up over the generations. And this extract from our wallpaper analysis just shows we go all the way back into the 18th century with wallpaper at the house, but it's often overlaid and hidden behind additions that have been made through the house. We've not been able to keep all of it on display, but where we've had to cover wallpaper back up, it's been conserved so that it would remain in that place. It's been protected. And in several spots, we should be able to show that older wallpaper as well, to show how the house has evolved in decoration and taste over time. We've found some great things. This on the left is the partition way in the main hall. You see at the very top there the little disc, which is the coat of arms. We've cleaned back all of this and will restore the decorative scheme that we found would have been here rather than what's there now, which is a 20th century scheme. So we've been able to uncover an awful lot of interesting stuff about the history of the house, and we can put a lot more of it on display. This area to the left is our new entrance lobby. It will look very different. There'll be a reception desk there, and that's where we'll greet visitors who can come in both from the park and through the entrance in the cafe. We're looking for all sorts of volunteers to help us, from front of house volunteers, people to help give walks and trails, to help guide visitors through the house. So there'll be lots of opportunities for people to get involved at the house as well, helping us to make sure it runs, because we're going to extend the opening hours. We'll be open in the week, we'll be open at the weekend, and we'll be open hopefully almost all the way through the year. Perhaps not quite 12 months, but not the seasonal opening that we had before. That's partly an appeal actually for anybody who wanted to be involved. And if you do want to be involved, you've got the generic details of the house, my details, also Kate Colker's details. She's the, well, says there, but Kate looks after all of the learning and public programs as well as the volunteers. There will be a large team of volunteers. We're hoping, all things going well, that we will be able to reopen the house in early 2022. Hopefully that looks on track, but you never quite know with some of the supply line issues that both COVID and Brexit have caused. But we are hopeful, and we will launch a bit more publicity in the form of a website and some social media the closer we get to opening the project. I haven't mentioned directly the Reconnecting Boston Manor Park project. I've done that quite simply because it's not one I work on. The Parks project is separately funded by the Heritage Community Fund and the Heritage Lottery Fund. And what you have there are the details both of the blog that updates about the activity that's happening in the park, but also the email for the park team as well. We'll be working with, as staff start to come online in the next kind of 6 to 12 months, who are working on the park. There'll be project staff who will be funded to help activities that happen in the park. We'll be working really closely with them. But just at this point, the projects are at slightly different speeds. So that project is really getting underway at a point where we're coming towards kind of completion of ours. So it's going to take a little time for us to get back on the same time scale, but we will obviously be treating this as a whole, because it doesn't make an awful lot of sense. It's all Boston Manor, and we want to make it the best visiting experience it can be. So hopefully by that will start by early 2022, and we'll be able to welcome visitors in. That's it from me. I will stop sharing. I'm very happy to take any questions that anybody has.
John, thank you very much for that. And that was absolutely fascinating. I have to admit to myself, never having been inside the house or really paid anything like enough attention to it when it was open. And I hadn't realized how many different uses it had been through. It reminds me a bit of the various buildings in Gunnersbury, particularly the small mansion, which of course was used as residential and has now deteriorated into a very, very sad state of repair. And I'm interested to hear your point about you've got to provide newsrooms and provide access, because I think the deterioration of the small mansion in Gunnersbury has been more noticeable since people moved out. It really has gone through a very bad state. I just wanted to ask you, did you say that the stables and buildings were still in situ in the park? I didn't think.
Yes,
Or are they?
they are. Yeah, in the early 90s, they were taken on a very long lease, so they are actually residential. So they're not part of the project at this point. They are kind of, obviously they're stakeholders in the project. They're our closest neighbours, but we've oriented the way that we'll open to give them some privacy, effectively. So we're switching anybody who does know the old roadside entrance. There are two large double gates, and we're going to switch the access to the gate that's further from the stables. Also, as well, that gives us a really clean view looking in at the house. So you'll get a very big impact point when you come in as well, and it leads you then directly into the park as well. So we'll have a new entrance effectively as part of this project as well. But yeah, the stables aren't part of the project.
Right. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Nothing's coming on the chat. Yes, I can see one. Roger Jarman. So I think someone needs, possibly need to unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? Yes, you have.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was really interesting, John. I've got a question about the gatehouse that I believe was attached to Boston Manor House, which went out to Windmill Road, because that was actually occupied by John Quincy Adams in the early 19th century when he was the ambassador to St James's. So I was wondering if during your research there was anything that you revealed about that property and whether it was linked to the Clitheroes or anyone else associated with the main house.
Yeah, we think it was. We think that we think now that the gatehouse is what is now the ride, that the house would have been there a little further away. It was the Clitheroes, as far as we can tell, that effectively had John Quincy Adams as the tenant there. We've not uncovered anything more about the detail of what that house was, unfortunately. But it's one of the things that is kind of marked out for further research. It's a very interesting story, and it's also one that I think would give us a different complexion as well. Unfortunately, what I'm saying is we've discovered that we think it was the ride and little else, unfortunately.
As a supplementary, I was wondering if you might have something in the house given over to maybe that particular part of the estate, so to speak, and then you could also link it to, you know, the president, well, eventually the president of the United States, in terms of John Quincy Adams. You could have a few boards really publicising his link with Boston Manor House.
One of the things that we're going to do actually is make sure that although there will be permanent displays, there's always going to be space in all of these. We're going to find out about the ongoing research, which we're going to do continually as part of the public programs. So we want to keep our public permanent exhibitions updated, and we want to keep people updated with the research as well. So actually, hopefully over the course, even of the year opening, we'll add more interpretation than we've actually got physical space for. So our special exhibitions, which do that interpretation work, we like to train people up to help us with the research and have what they do as part of the special will then have the potential to become part of the permanent displays, whether that's online or in interventions or an updating of what's there. All those options can be kept relatively open. So future research, especially the ones that acknowledges John Quincy Adams, I'm constantly being told by a lot of people that link to John Quincy Adams, and in particular Boston, would bring an enormous number of tourists who are extremely proud of John Quincy Adams. And Heathrow isn't that far. It should be a potential thing that we can make.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I've got a number of questions coming on the chat. So if I can give you them just in the order they've come in. How will the house be sustainable in the long term? Will there be some overarching trust to care for the house?
Yeah, COVID has made trust very difficult at the moment. It was when the original, I think, kind of planning that there would be a sense that that could evolve and have better governance. It was part of the application process to get the funding. COVID has put the brakes on that to a degree because there's so much uncertainty. But as I mentioned about what the house will do, it will have the ability to raise more revenue by itself. And the council still has quite advanced plans about how governance could support the house so that it's in a good footing. So effectively that it doesn't get left unnoticed again. It will obviously open with quite a degree of fanfare, we hope, and quite a lot to see. But it's, as you mentioned about governance yourselves earlier, it's really important to put those things in place. And we're just really emerging from COVID to see what that needs to look like in the future. So I don't have a definitive answer of what it will be. For the moment, we are Hounslow Council run, operated. That's who I work for and who the staff will work for. So but the council's supported the project, very strongly, continues to do so, and we will hopefully be coming out of relatively soon, and the house at that point should be on a much better footing.
A related question about sustainability or funding. You mentioned meeting rooms on the top floor. Will there be lift access? So I guess the question really is, are they fully accessible?
Yes, I got carried away while I was speaking. I was supposed to mention the lift. One of the things that happened with derelict spaces meant that we had we've basically added a lift that will go from the ground floor and the second floor with very minimal impact to the building. It will pop out slightly at the second floor, but it will be otherwise hidden within the building itself, so it won't be bolted onto the outside. It's a very sympathetic way to do it, and it will mean that all of the spaces are completely accessible.
Thank you. Now a question about the building with the clock. Who lives in the building with the clock? Does it come from the stables? And what is the next door modern building, which I guess we saw in your slide?
The modern building replaced a much older gatehouse. I ummed and ahed about an image of that one actually as we were going, but I could have added hundreds of images to this. That's all part of the same long residential let that I mentioned from the early 90s. So that complex is not Hounslow managed at all. Effectively, those are residential properties.
So, sorry, so is the clock on the stables?
Yes, the clock is on the stables, yeah, but those are all private dwellings.
Okay, thank you. And the last question so far on the chat is all about the Clitheroe family. Do we know what happened to the family after they left? Are any of them still around? And have they had anything to do with the restoration?
They've not had anything to do with the restoration. There is sort of some surviving links, but we know a lot more about the Clitheroes when they were in the house, enough so that they'll be the primary story of the house. And it's one of the aspects where we really would like to keep researching. It's one of the difficult things when you're going from such a position that we're in where the whole building needed to be restored. Once you start to uncover pieces of the history, so we have everything from stories of servants now. We've got so many threads that we want to pull on that will keep enhancing the interpretation, and that's one that we'll obviously try and explore and see if we can do it, obviously privacy permitting, for anybody who does want to be involved. But those 20th century stories are certainly something we'll go for. People would have gone to that school still in living memory, and something about the school that was at Boston Manor as well would be, we've had a couple of contacts from people who are at the school, and we'd really like to develop that as well. 21 years of schooling, that's worth something, and certainly the Institute of House Workers as well great kind of 20th century stories to find out about. So even if we can't track down any bona fide Clitheroes, there's plenty of other tracking down and research that we want to keep doing.
I mean, the Clitheroes have got so much connection with the area. I mean, their name crops up a lot, so there must be quite a lot of recorded information, hopefully.
There really is. They were magistrates. They were, prominent throughout their residence in the house. There's different levels of interest, but there are so many other stories that we can tell, even on top of the stories that are going to form the permanent exhibition. So there'll be plenty about the Clitheroes. I could probably do about 3 hours on the Clitheroes, but I assume people will want supper and bedtime.
We'll do that next time. A succession questions about just a little more clarification about John Quincy Adams. Did he live there or just visit? And if he lived there, is there any plan to have a commemorative plaque?
There's not. No, we're not entirely sure where on the ride he was. We've got a rough idea. He basically rented the house that was on land that the Clitheroes owned. There's not an enormous amount that suggests much interaction other than that basic, unfortunately, but it's one again that we can dive into. It's not what we have at the moment isn't particularly strong enough to make a fuss of, but it's interesting enough for us to put some emphasis to find stuff out about. I'd love to know precisely where it was on the road, but that road is very much changed from how it was, so it's going to take a lot more desk work to work that out, unfortunately.
Okay, well, so we've got 2 or 3 people on this call on this meeting with a particular interest in John Quincy Adams, so may be able to comment if anyone wants to comment any more on that, or maybe can be in touch with you at a future time.
Yes, if anyone wants to get involved with helping us with that, be very, very welcome. Any of the I'd love to hear from people who are interested.
Roger, you're coming back, yes. You need to unmute or
There we go. I can come back on that because there was a project that Ealing Fields History Group did on John Quincy Adams, and a book that was published about 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know if John has seen that. It was quite extensive research, actually. I wasn't directly involved, but I know of the work and the publications available. And I think that the property might be actually on Windmill Road, isn't it? So you've got the ride going from Boston Manor House right through to Windmill Road. And I believe, I mean, obviously that's open to some debate, but I thought it was actually where Windmill Road hits the ride, and it was demolished, that property, potentially, I think, in the early 20th century. But John Quincy Adams was quite well known in the local community, and of course it was the time when John Soane was active, and Turner was active. I don't, it was an interesting time when Ealing certainly was in the process of developing, as well as obviously Brentford as well. So I think it is something that is worthy, probably, as you say, maybe of a temporary exhibition or maybe something more permanent.
Yeah, and that would be the hope, actually. I certainly, personally, from what I've seen, I agree that windmill kind of location at the end of the ride would make sense, especially with the descriptions of what the house was. It would certainly make sense for it to be in the location. It would be nice to make that a bit more concrete than what I've seen, but I've not seen the book in great detail. We had a professional researcher going through, and we just can't reach everything to the extent that you would like. Unfortunately, we didn't have the bottomless pit for that, I'm afraid. But it's absolutely anyone who's interested in this, if you'd like to help us develop content for that, we'd love to hear from you, and we'll support that with further kind of professional research and turning that into that special exhibition, which hopefully is strong enough for us to do more.
Well, I can certainly put you in touch. Well, I've got your details, haven't I? I could put you in touch with the people that were actually involved in the production of that piece of work.
Fantastic.
So another point of clarification, I think, certainly from somebody who is not immediately local, where is the ride? I think I can get it from what I've heard, but can you make it clearer to?
It sits. If you know where the house is, easiest to explain is that it's almost directly opposite the road-facing side of the house. The biggest feature there now is the school, which is a small road that is no longer fully accessible for vehicles, but does connect on foot through to Windmill on the other side. So it's formally part of the estate, as so much of that area is, but long time since it has been.
Right, so it comes out on Windmill just north of Gunnersby School. Is that? Am I in the right place?
I just broke up for a second then, I'm sorry.
Sorry. So it comes out on Windmill Road just north of Gunnersby School. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
I can picture it, but I've never noticed the other end of it. So we're running, for the benefit of the person who asked the question, we're talking about running virtually due east from Boston Manor Road.
Yeah.
And it's probably on maps, but I don't have a map in front of me.
It's what the bus stop has the house named after. And there was some debate about whether that would be better named Boston Manor House or to keep the ride. So I'm interested to hear that the ride isn't immediately apparent. It's not gone anywhere, unfortunately. So that it will remain the ride for the foreseeable future at that bus stop.
Right. I think somebody's looking or found it on a map. Yes, the person who asked the question has found it. So we're all is now clear. I don't know, does anybody else want to comment? Any further comments on this? I'm keeping an eye on the time so we can wrap things up. As I say, as John has said, for those who want to eat or do other things with their evening. If anybody else would like to comment, please use the raise hand feature or put something in the chat. Or if there are any other questions for John? No, I can't see anybody. I'm just checking to see if I can see anybody waving. No. Right. In which case, John, thank you again very much. I mean, that has, being just outside Ealing, has probably given us information about something that none of us has known enough about. So absolutely fascinating. And we'll get you back again. You can talk for 3 hours about the Clitheroes.
Yes, very happy to.
Maybe slightly less. Can I just take the opportunity then to thank everybody who's joined us for joining us, and just to remind our members of our next planned event, taking the place of the annual lecture, the commemoration of Corin's contribution to civic life, to be held, as I say, at the beginning of June, probably on the 10th. So this will be a unique event, so please do try and join us. We'll send out a reminder in the usual way and Zoom details a bit closer to the time. That brings us to the end of the meeting. I hope that you've enjoyed it and found it successful as another virtual event. And thank you very much. And we'll allow you to leave and close the meeting in a few moments.
Mm-hmm.